Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I'm your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for zero point 0.1 ASHA CEU. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. Dr. Danielle Scott receives a salary as an associate clinical professor at Northeastern University Charlotte. She receives an honorarium from Speech Therapy PD for participating as a guest on the podcast. Dr. Scott is a board member of the National Black Association of Speech, Language, and Hearing and the co-chair of the Cultural Humility Ambassador Task Force. My financial disclosure is I'm the owner and founder of BrainBridge Connect, and as the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, I receive financial compensation from Speech Therapy PD for the podcasts and other educational webinars. I'm also an adjunct instructor at both James Madison University and Old Dominion University. My non-financial disclosure is that I'm the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be written in the chat box or the Q&A box and will be answered throughout the presentation as long as they are on topic. Now, without further ado, we welcome our guest, R. Danielle Scott, PhD, CCC-SLP, who is an associate clinical professor in the Communication Sciences and Disorders program at Northeastern University Charlotte. She earned her bachelor's degree in psychology and comparative women's studies from Spelman College, her master's degree in speech language pathology from Indiana University, and her PhD in psychology with an emphasis in cognition and instruction from Grand Canyon University. Dr. Scott's scholarship centers on cultural humility, therapeutic relationships, and social justice within speech, language, and hearing sciences. Her commitment to justice, belonging, and liberation drives both her research and pedagogical approach. I always mess that word up, I'm sorry. As the Northeastern University Center for Advancing Teaching and Learning Through Research, Innovative Teaching Excellence Fellow, she advances inclusive, anti-oppressive teaching practices that transform educational experiences. Dr. Scott serves as a board member of the National Black Association for Speech, Language, and Hearing in Basel and co-chairs the Cultural Humility Task Force, furthering her dedication to equity and representation in the field. Welcome, Dr. Scott. So nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. And so I like to get started with just, if you're comfortable sharing your why, your story of how you got into the field. I think it's very makes us more human for our listeners to find out why we became CST professionals and even so far as moving into the realm of academia that you've moved into and now are kind of serving exclusively, even though you have a lot of projects that you're doing for advocacy and research on the side. So, do you mind sharing your story with us?
Sure. So I would say I have always wanted to be a professor since I was a little girl. I knew I was going to be in education. It's very weird for a 7-year-old to say they want to be a professor, but that was me. So teaching has always been something that I just knew was a part of my purpose. But I went to Spelman College for undergrad and I actually majored in psychology. And I started doing research in psychology. I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll be a women's counselor because I also majored in women's studies and I started doing some kind of volunteer work in the counseling space. And I just realized I like counseling, but I can't be like crying and I don't know how to like separate. I was very young and I was like taking on people's things. So I was like, I wonder if there's something I can do that involves counseling, but maybe isn't like directly only counseling. And then as I was doing research in the psychology department, my advisor actually recommended speech language pathology to me. And we were doing research on motor development. And in fact, the children, we were working with toddlers, and the children that we were working with, one little girl in particular, she was she was using full sentences and she was like less than 2 years old. And I was just mesmerized by her. Her mom was a speech therapist. And so we got close. And that's basically how I kind of shift from psychology, and then I applied to speech programs. I did take a gap year and I taught English in China for a year and then came back and went to graduate school. So, yeah, I've had like a unique path, I would say, to the field. And then even after becoming an SLP, I knew I wanted to get my PhD. I wanted to teach, but I did not want to get another degree in SLP just because I felt like there were some missing pieces in my degree and I didn't want another clinical degree. So I decided to go back to my first love, which is psychology. And that's where I studied therapeutic relationships and counseling. And kind of that was my, in culture humility. And that really was my bridge back to our field.
Oh, that's so cool. I didn't know 90% of that's you taught English in China. Really? That's so cool. That's very cool. How did you find that to kind of expand your horizons in your I'm sure that's definitely changed your perspective on cultural humility and just thinking about the differences in culture.
Yeah, it's so funny because I think I stumbled on cultural response. I didn't know it what had a name, but if I look
Mhm.
back on my path, there has been so many things that really just led me to this being like a core value. But even having that gap year, one thing that was really big was the emphasis on learning English and how serious that was. And it really made me think like, is English that amazing? I mean, I was so excited to learn more of their culture and it was like, okay, English, English, English. And so I didn't realize the dominance of English in terms of and how it was very much correlated with your intellect and even like your potential, your academic potential. And so I think that gave me a unique lens when I came back to graduate school and we started learning about cultural and linguistic diversity and just, trying to think about what does this look like, this standard language ideology of English being so centralized in a lot of our conversations about language. So I think it gave me a really unique aspect in that way, but also just immersing yourself in someone else's culture. You have to be very humble. You have to be open-minded. You have to really release judgment because you are looking at other people and the way they live through your own lived experience. And so that gave me really practical knowledge in that area. So I've always carried that with me.
Yeah, well, and I think it really speaks to the way that you're teaching, and that was one of the things I think that really kind of interested me about talking to you was that, you're more full time in the academic space and I'm adjunct, and it's trying to bridge these gaps of how our students are learning, particularly, and I almost hate using this term, but it's true, the post-COVID generation, because right now what we're seeing is our post-COVID college undergrads are now finishing up grad school and going into their CF, and uh, our COVID high schoolers are moving into their mid to late undergraduate experiences and possibly going into graduate school. And it's a different learning experience for them, but it's very much a different teaching experience, I think, for those of us who've been teaching, whether it's full time or adjunct, for a period of time now, because we're looking at how do we build our classes so that our students can be successful because it's changed. And it, to me, some of it's radical change, but also it's change that's based in systems that were always in place that weren't set up for, say, when I went to graduate school, didn't feel like it was really set up for me to be successful. It was set up for the program, right? So it wasn't set up to foster needs of me as a returning adult student with children at that time. It was set up that I will follow these rules and these specificities that were required of me, whether it was convenient or not.
Mhm.
And I think that's kind of where you and I initially connected was how do we build these class spaces to promote better outcomes. And so can you talk to us about how things like ungrading or alternate grading has sort of changed how we present our coursework to our students and what the expectation is?
Sure. So ungrading is something when I first became a professor, so I've actually been in academia for 5 years now, which is crazy to me because the time has flown by. But when I first started, I was very, very intentional of taking as many courses as I could, professional development in pedagogy. And so my PhD is the emphasis is in cognition and instruction. So we focus a lot on just like adult learners, diverse adult learners. So I had a little bit of background, but I still wanted to make sure, I had a full understanding of just like the art of teaching and the different ways to teach. And I had in my mind an idea of these are all the things that happened to me in grad school, and I'm not going to do that to other people. You know what I mean? But it wasn't
Yes.
necessarily grounded. It was just more of this is my personal experience. It wasn't necessarily grounded in pedagogy. And so I learned about anti-racist pedagogy. I took different courses. So our Center for Teaching, many universities have those where you can take courses and webinars and be in programs. And so I learned about anti-oppressive teaching, started with anti-racist teaching. I learned about disability justice and integrating that in your teaching. I learned about trauma-informed pedagogy. So many different ways of teaching. And then as I was learning about different ways to teach, and I was tasked with teaching diversity, equity, and inclusion courses, I felt like the grading was the biggest thing that was opposite of what I was teaching. Like, how do you teach equity and inclusion, but your processes are actually really making a huge power dynamic in your classroom? And so I felt like learning about ungrading or decentering traditional grading really gave me that balance I needed in the classroom. So I wasn't just talking about something, I was actually doing it and modeling that. And so there's lots of research on ungrading. Some people call it ungrading, some people call it alternative grading, but I can't remember the first name, but NUO, there's a book called Labor-Based Grading, and that's from writing, the field of writing. So a lot of ungrading research is from the field of writing and teaching, like first year beginning English in your lower level English courses. I also learned about specifications grading. Oh, there's so many different types, I would guess. But in general, under this umbrella of ungrading is really thinking about how do I decenter this power dynamic of extrinsic motivation and encourage intrinsic motivation? Because by the time you get to your master's program, all you want is A's. All the students are like, I got to get an A, I got to get an A. They're very grade focused and they're not learning focused because they know I have to get an A because I have to do this and da 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 da. And so when you don't foster intrinsic motivation, then learning is not really the goal. The goal is the grade. So how do we decenter that from the process? So I'll just give an example, I suppose. In a course that I taught this summer, it was school-based issues in SLP. And so we were talking about how to work in the school setting. And we talked about, special education legislation and service delivery models and all that cool school-based stuff. And I wanted the grading to model what it would be like to work in a school. Well, when you work in a school, you aren't graded. You have supervisors who observe you, who usually give you feedback. Many times you are evaluated the same way a teacher is evaluated. Also, you are evaluated by your work. So other special education teachers read your IEPs that you write. They read the reports that you write. And so there is a lot of maybe even seeking feedback from other people. So what I designed was self-assessment grading. So the students created a portfolio. They had options for assignments that they could do, and then they were required to get peer feedback and instructor feedback. And then at the end of the course, they created the portfolio and they filled out several rubrics and justified what they felt like their grade should be based on all of the feedback they received, if they actually took that feedback in and resubmitted their work. So it's really putting an emphasis not on grading, but effort, labor that comes with if I'm going to resubmit, if I'm going to consider someone's constructive feedback and actually implement that. So all of the labor that they put into the process of learning rather than just the grade.
Yeah, no, and I think that's brilliant because and my husband's an instructor, so I was talking to him about this actually when I was prepping for the podcast, and he said, "Oh, yeah, that his is more pretty straightforward. There are no it's pretty rigid as far as what their curriculum is, and I won't explain why because it's just a different methodology, but it's just it's a different way of thinking about it, but in a good way because we're having to reach students now, I think, more than ever where they're at. And people like you and other instructors who are coming along and trying to remap, if you will, how we teach is more about, like you said, the intrinsic motivation. Because I think when I was in grad school, I'm trying to just get through the material, finish, right? The finish line is here. And you just got to do these things and check these boxes and you'll be done. You got to take the practice. You got to do comps. You might have to do a thesis and you got to do these things. And at the end of the day, when you get into the field, you're like, I still don't know what the heck I'm doing.
Mhm.
Right. And so I think the way that you're doing it is teaching people who are also instructors and not just the students that we can revamp the way that we're doing things in a way that fosters people being more invested. So, I'm thinking long term, we're decreasing things like burnout because we hear so much about that now in the field of people being just like overwhelmed by the caseload. If you're in schools, you're overwhelmed by your caseload if you're in acute care. If you're in private practice and outpatient, the reimbursement is so bad and your salary is so low. And there's all these other pieces that we're hearing about that really don't make it sound like a positive place to work, right? And it doesn't sound like something that you want to get into if you're what 23, 24 coming out of grad school if you're fortunate enough to go straight through. Me, I was closer to like my late 30s because it was my second career coming out. And so even for me as a grown up, like I'm a grown up with a family. Like I like you, I'd lived in another country. I'm just trying to check these boxes and get done, right?
Mhm.
I learn the material because that's just who I am. But for those students who aren't intrinsically motivated to learn that material, I can see where that would be a huge barrier. And so, one of the things that I found super interesting about your work is the suggested deadlines instead of firm due dates. So, can
Mhm.
you explain that a little bit further?
Yeah, so I mean, even thinking about anti-racist teaching, a lot of anti-racist teaching has to do with disrupting the culture of white supremacy and what that looks like. And so it really looks like perfectionism, it looks like
Hmm.
individualism, it looks like a sense of urgency. And you can feel urgency when you're usually reading a syllabus. And so sometimes it can be like traumatic because all you see is deadlines and you must do this and these policies and how that feels in your body. So there is a lot of urgency, usually is the blueprint of the course structure. And so in thinking about inclusive teaching, you really want to think about, especially in regard to like anti-racist teaching, how am I going to disrupt this sense of perfectionism and the sense of urgency? And one way to do that is to really encourage students. So back to that intrinsic motivation and really encouraging students to turn in their best work. Would I prefer you turn in something in a week that is your best work versus turn it in now and it's you didn't try because you were meeting the deadline? I'm grading you based on did you meet the deadline, not your work. So really giving students that autonomy. And a lot of people think, well, how is that real world? Well, think about it like this. If you are a school-based SLP, you have a caseload of 60. You have all these deadlines for you have to have their evaluation done by this date. You have to have the IEP meeting done by this date. But is someone going to sit there with you and hold your hand and say, in order to have the eval done this day, you need to test them on this day and you need to write the report on this day? No, you have full autonomy to do that. So, in the same way, you know this is a 16-week course. You could wait until the end to do all your work. I don't know why you would do that. And so you're setting it up in a way that they are encouraged to do their work because there is something motivating behind it. So, meaning if you do your work, you're going to get feedback. And guess what? You could resubmit it. And then you'll be more likely to get a grade that you want. If you don't take the opportunity to turn it in with enough time, then you won't get that feedback and you'll miss that opportunity. And so, how do I build in that intrinsic motivation? I give them really high quality feedback, which means it takes me a while to grade because I'm giving them qualitative feedback. And then they start to enjoy that. They start to look for it. I'm never going to say, C rubric. I'm going to give them, so then they're like, oh, now I know. And that's a part of the learning process. So, really giving them, so what I do is I create a course map, and the course map has flexible due dates. And those due dates are flexible to help them with pacing because I'm not just going to say, turn all your work in at the end of the class by 11:59. But I give them pacing. But then if you miss something or if you don't like this pace, change the pace. But I challenge them to, if you don't like the pace I've set your own pace, but you must set a pace. And I am going to check in with you if I haven't seen anything from you at, a certain level of the course. And so that has been an experience where it is hard for me because I don't know when I'm going to grade, but this isn't really about me. It's more about their learning. And it challenges them to get at the root of their procrastination, or some of them get at the root of their perfectionism. And so we're really working on those are life skills that you
Hmm.
have an opportunity to work on because you set up a lot of flexibility and autonomy.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a lot to, like a lot of us like you who are speaking at conferences and conventions and doing other things, teaching other courses, being on a podcast, for example, or, you know, prepping things for, like I said, other state conventions, courses, all that kind of stuff. Because I know people who do everything last minute, like they're the night of or the morning of it. They're teaching
Mhm.
a 10 a.m. class and they're in there at 8 a.m. I don't operate that way. It's just not my personality. I need it to be like mostly final draft a week out. So for me, it is intrinsic motivation because no one's riding me to get it done. I don't have to turn in handouts by a certain date for some places you do, but by and large, I think it sets you up to move into the field and not just be a student, but to say, okay, you have this opportunity now where maybe you're teaching other people, whether it's your peers or you're mentoring a CF or you're mentoring students and you do have some deadlines when you're doing that for turning in paperwork and providing evaluations and things like that, but are you going to get ahead of it? Or are you going to wait till the last minute? And so I think you're right on with a lot of it is not only intrinsic motivation but personality too, because
Mhm.
some people just like they fly on the last minute. I'm not a Flying on the last minute is just not me. Flying on the last minute makes me super nervous.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
would need to have it more structured. So I think as an instructor, that part for me changing that mindset is a little bit of a challenge because I know what my schedule looks like and I want to make sure that I'm giving ample time to grade and I'm giving ample time to provide constructive feedback that's not only constructive but it's helpful. Right. I don't want to just shoot a student down. I want to say, hey, this is an example of how you could change this particular piece or whatever it is based on the assignment. And so, yeah, I think it's just changing our mindset, which for some people is really challenging because they're used to that very firm adhered to deadline, that very firm adhered to curricula that doesn't take into consideration that, our students now more than ever have varying life experiences.
They do.
And even for me, I had a student last semester who, and I think I'm pretty sure I shared this with you, but I had a student whose father was working during the pandemic. He had lost his job and he went out of state and was working away from the family, and he unfortunately actually got murdered, and she had to take a leave of absence from her senior year, and she was like ready to graduate in May, and she had to take a leave of absence late February to go attend the trial in another state, which was I can't even imagine. Like, that's incredibly for a person who's 21, 22 years old. That's a challenge anyway, no matter what your age is. And then you're trying to finish this rigorous program of academics, of trying to get into graduate school, of trying to figure out, moving on from living with my parents to living somewhere else. Or maybe you're out of state living in a dorm and now you got to move into a part. Like, there's so many pieces of that that I think a lot of people forget when they're teaching students. And so that's a huge consideration too, and why I really think that shift away from perfectionism is so important, and
Mm.
that shift away from not thinking about that, like, not as instructors, us not saying, okay, we need to be flexible too, because our students are going through these incredible challenges. I lost my dad my first semester of grad school, and so I think about that. And again, I was a returning adult. I wasn't 22, I was in my 30s, and had to take midterms on time. I didn't get extensions. I think I
Oh,
had one instructor who gave me an extension, and it was just brutal. It was brutal.
but you know, the opposite of perfectionism is fear. And so to
Yeah.
really up it's fear of not being enough. And to really uproot that, you replace it with compassion. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, my student experience that I had that like set in stone for me, we're not doing that. We are only doing flexible deadlines. I am committed to this. Was I had a student, this was so I started in academia in 2021. So I started with people still dying of COVID. Okay. So
Yeah.
it was a very sad time, a time where the racial climate was just, it was a rough time. Right. And I remember a student, I'm teaching an undergrad course, and a student sent me a very long email and attached a funeral program to justify why their work was late. And that made me so sad because it
Mm-hmm.
made me think, did you think I wasn't going to believe you when you said your uncle passed away, that you had to attack? Like, this is sad. So I don't want to, and a lot of times you put yourself in this situation of judging what is a good enough excuse. Oh, uncle died. I guess that's okay. Well, I mean, it's not your grandma, it's your uncle. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm not judging when or is someone's grief enough to excuse this deadline. No, I'm going to give every person the benefit of the doubt. We have these flexible deadlines. If you need extra time to make sure your work is in, and then equity is about giving people what they need. So for a
Mm-hmm.
student like you who lost a parent during grad school, maybe that looks like different assign. Maybe that looks like a final conference where we're verbally talking. Like maybe it looks different. Every student doesn't need the same thing to learn. And I think it is the human in us to think that someone who is grieving should have a different learning experience. So, you know, it kind of takes the pressure off of, okay, what is a good excuse? What's not? I need the proof. Let me see I don't need to see any of that. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Well, yeah, and I think too that it speaks to good leaders, right? So when you get out into the workforce, once you're out of the academic realm, when you have good leaders in your established workplace, it's the same kind of thing. You have leaders who are like, yeah, take the time you need, or, let us know what you need. And then you have leaders who are like, ridiculous that you could only have your 2 days of bereavement leave and you will come back and be a robot after that. And it's the same mindset. It's the same principle that just because it's your uncle might have raised you, right? It doesn't mean that that's any less impactful than it being a biological parent or biological grandparent, because for a lot of people, what their family situation looks like at home and who they consider a parent or a person that's their support person in their family may not be the same as what tradition holds from a two-parent family with grandparents who are also supportive and all these other family members that are. It doesn't, by and large nowadays, it doesn't look like that. it's insane to me that people still think about it in this hierarchical space when that's not what everybody's family looks like, right?
It's
So
so
I think,
culturally influenced, this even the idea of immediate family and extended family, that is a Western cultural,
mhm,
concept. So absolutely.
yeah. Well, and going back to like theoretical frameworks of even things like the cultural humility, but also intersectionality of how, we're teaching our students. How do we apply both of those things to inclusive teaching? Because I think, you've given some examples of that, but I think people don't think about those frameworks and those research based, because, in our field, we're always talking about evidence based, right? Evidence based this and evidence based that. And I think what a lot of times people lose sight of is they're reading research or they're looking at research or they're looking at mostly social media and they're gaining these insights and these blurbs off of TikTok and Instagram, and they're not actually doing the research and vetting the research and looking at what the research question is in some of these articles and how it's backed up by the science. And I think that's where we miss a beat too when it comes to frameworks. And so, what are some ways that we can look at those theoretical frameworks of things like intersectionality and cultural humility and how we apply that? I think you've done a really great job on touching on inclusive teaching, but what about for CF mentorship and what about for our those of us who are mentoring students that are doing their clinical placements?
Mhm. So, I mean, even when it comes to the importance of theoretical frameworks, I think a lot of people supervise and teach the way they taught and the way they
Hmm.
were supervised, even if those weren't the best experiences. And that doesn't make sense when you really think about it. You wouldn't do any other thing based on just your life experience. So, it is so important to read the literature, to be rooted in your theoretical framework. So, I'll talk about intersectionality and culture humility, and then like how to actually put those things in action when it comes to mentorship and supervision and teaching. So cultural humility is a framework by doctors Turvalon and Murray Garcia, who are out in California. Their article from 1998 is the article that I always refer to because they really coined that term culture humility. If you have never heard of that term, or you want to learn more, please read their Hallmark article. And then also they have a short documentary to go with the article on YouTube. It's just 30 minutes. And so their definition of cultural humility is lifelong learning, critical self-reflection or self-evaluation, being able to build mutually beneficial partnerships, and that includes shifting power dynamics or redressing power dynamics. And then the last pillar of cultural humility is institutional accountability or institutional consistency. And that really differs from traditional models of cultural competence, because cultural competence is all about, I got to get the knowledge and the skills and I'll be able to do something. But cultural humility is more about, I will never know everything. So I have to be in this posture of humility and learning and reflecting on who I am. So cultural competency, there are never questions about, well, who is the instructor? Well, what is their worldview? What are their beliefs? So it is a personal journey, but then also that institutional accountability piece is really going to look at systems and how do we disrupt isms. So when it comes to lifelong learning, that part of culture humility, the instructor is a learner and the learners are learners. We are all learning. And so one of the best things you can do is to model that you will never know enough by learning and partnering with your students in their learning. So that could even be, hey, y'all, I took a PD last night on this and this because I really need to brush up on my skills. I'm very vulnerable on my areas that I'm still learning. Also, even when I set up courses, if I just because I teach a course, that doesn't mean I'm an expert in all of the content. So I might bring in, no, we're going to have a guest lecture for this topic, or I'm going to make sure someone with that lived experience is actually giving you this information, because the information for me is about someone and I want you to learn from someone. So that is an example of lifelong learning. When it comes to critical self-reflection, I think that's where that intersectionality piece comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And so intersectionality is a term, it's really from Black feminism. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a lawyer, feminist, and her use of the term really comes from the marginalization that Black women experience at the intersection of race and sex. So basically, this term is that there are interlocking systems of oppression, and race is going to compound those experiences of oppression. So if you think about the disability justice movement, there was racism in the disability justice movement. If you think about the LGBTQ movement, there is racism in that movement. So race is going to compound those things. So when you are engaging in critical self-reflection, you are thinking about your positionality. Who are you? What are your experiences? What is your worldview? What are your beliefs? What are your values? We all have different identities. What are your privileged identities and what are your marginalized identities? So, for me as a Black woman, yes, being Black and being a woman, those are marginalized identities, but also
Mm-hmm.
I'm a professor. I have a PhD. That is not a marginalized identity. Those are privileges. I'm not someone who has a visible disability. That is a privilege. So I'm constantly thinking about what are my marginalized identities, but also what are my privileged identities, because my privilege identities are going to bring blind spots and bias. So I'm constantly doing that work. So when people talk about intersectionality, that is that personal work that you have to do in order to engage in reflection. Another part, the last two parts of cultural humility, so building mutually beneficial partnerships, that's just simply building partnerships with communities that aren't paternalistic, meaning you don't know what is best for people. People know what is best for them. So you are returning agency. And the best way we can do that is build community in our classrooms. So instead of me saying, here are the learning objectives, we should learn it like this, I'm going to say, here are the learning objectives. However, what do you need to get from this class? So sometimes, if possible, I'll send out like a pre-course survey. Like, I see the learning objectives, y'all don't read them anyway. So what did you signed up for this class? What did you think you were going to learn? Or what do you want to learn? So I'm making sure I bring that in. What is still confusing to you? So you're constantly seeking feedback. So you're building community, you're seeing your students. That is the most practical way you can do that. And then finally, this institutional accountability part is just, if every SLP was culturally responsive, we would still have isms because these are structures. We would still have health inequity, we would still have educational inequity. So how do we think about systems? So that is having explicit conversations and opportunities to address systemic racism and systemic sexism and all of those different things. An example I can give in my teaching is that in our DEI and SLP course, we did a community engagement activity where we went to one of the oldest housing, what is it called? Oldest public housing places in Charlotte, and we did a literacy event. So instead of saying, come to our university that you probably never come to, we went out into their neighborhood, into their community. The recruitment was, we partnered with an organization who had already been doing this work, and then our students set up stations and we partnered with the library, and we were able to host a literacy rich event. But it wasn't us pushing what we felt the community needed. It was partnering with an organization who knew the community, who was a part of the community. And then we had the humility and said, okay, well, this is what we can offer. And that was such a meaningful experience for the students.
I bet. Well, and probably from the instructors as well, because it's always when you get out into the community, and that's why, I always talk about micro volunteerism and just volunteerism in general for your state organization or other organizations that you can be a part of, whether it's like a disease specific or a disorder specific organization. There's so many opportunities for us to meet people where they are. And I think you learn a lot from that and you can take it back into your teaching. But even just as a community advocate, you learn so much from that because what you don't see, like you said, when you're saying, oh, we're a university or, oh, we're a big health system. We're like where I used to work was the biggest health system in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they would host these health fairs. Well, a lot of our patients don't have access to reliable or consistent transportation.
Mhm.
They're no
Mhm.
longer able to drive, or maybe they never drove. Maybe they just, financially, that's not feasible for them. Maybe where they live in a rural area wasn't the norm. Literacy in the healthcare space is definitely an issue. A lot of our education elements are built around a ninth grade or higher literacy expectation, and that's just not reasonable for a lot of community members. And I think sometimes people get fixated on, oh, well, it has to be rural or it has to be a lower socioeconomic status community, and that's not always the case. A lot of our communities, I'm in an area where we have 7 cities that are relatively close together. We have 4 military bases. We have the largest health system in the Commonwealth, here by the coast, but an hour and 15 minutes from the capital of our state. It doesn't make any sense, is what my
Mhm.
point is. There's so many gaps and so many ways that we could be moving into that community space versus expecting that they'll come to us versus us going to them.
Mhm.
So I think that's a great work. It's a relationship centered approach, not only modeling that for the students and younger, less seasoned clinicians, but also maybe for faculty members who have come from other like other situations, other settings. Maybe they're international faculty. Maybe they are from a completely different area in the U.S. because that's someone who's in rural Iowa, for example, is not going to have the same experience that I'm going to have in coastal Virginia, is not going to have the same experience as you in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I think that's a really important point to make in thinking about how we can look outside the box and meet people where they are, because we hear that term a lot, right? We hear meet people where they are when it comes to patient care, when it comes to trauma informed care. But when you're on the flip side and you're mentoring students or you're teaching students, you're not necessarily doing that. So,
Mhm.
how can we shift that mindset of we're doing these things for our patients or our students when it comes to school based settings, but we're not doing that for our communities? And why is that? Why are we like compartmentalizing where we choose to use this model, but where we're choosing not to use the model?
Well, I think it's the same way. Like, it's easy to say, oh, community and meet people where they are, but then we don't build community in our classrooms. Everyone is an individual and no group work because you're going to cheat. And, we have those mindsets. And so, the foundation of community engagement is trust. And when you think about equity, it's not just about giving people what they need, but it's also about giving people back what has previously been withheld from them, aka reparations. So you're thinking about, is there mistrust currently and what has been done historically to this community? So what has been withheld? What resources have been withheld? What experiences have been withheld? And then you're giving back those resources and experiences when you're doing the work. But also when it comes to trust, it's really about universities are known for coming in, doing something great, and taking it all back. Kind of like an early intervention where you come and you have like your really big speech bag and you have all these cool games and you're like, you go in someone's house and the parents are like, oh my God, they're talking. And then you're like, yeah, that was great. And then you put everything back in your bag and you go back in your car and you leave. And the family's like, so what are we supposed to do when that lady's not here? And so it's the same thing. I think universities do that when it comes to like research studies. We're going to do a 6-week study and you get all this resource and you get all this information. And now we're done. Good job. So building trust means there are organizations that are always doing this work. Most of them are unfunded and they are doing it because they are a part of the community. So how do I partner with them? The event that we did, it is an event that there has already been a partnership and they're going to do the event in September. They're going to do it again in March. So this is not a one-off. And I think that's what I was telling the students. You cannot build trust with these one-off opportunities. The same way in a classroom, you can't build trust because one day we had this project where everyone got to talk, or one time we did this thing. It is ongoing. Relationship is ongoing. You have to build relationships. You have to cultivate relationships. You have to repair relationships when there has been harm. You have to monitor relationships by seeking feedback. So, there's such an incredible opportunity to model relational pedagogy in very practical ways.
Yeah, and I think taking it back to when you said like group projects, one of the things that I found with students is they don't like doing group projects because they have this traditional thing in their head of like maybe they were in high school or maybe they are undergrads, but they are thinking there's a group of four. There's going to be one or two of us that are doing the work, and the other two are never going to be responsive. They're not going to be holding up to their end of the bargain. And so getting the students to buy in to group work can be challenging because maybe their past experience and their lived experience has not been a positive one. And so part of that for me, what I tend to say is even if we're just doing like because I teach undergraduate clinical observation and technical writing, one of the things I have them do is get into groups and they go through technical writing and they look for ways they could improve it or whatever. And what they always, there's all same thing. There's always these one person or maybe two of the four group cohort, the four group little group. They'll say, they're the ones who are the speakers, right? They're the ones who are doing all the talking, and the other two are just kind of sitting there and they're not saying anything. And I don't know that it's their group buy-in or if it's their shy. Like it's hard to read sometimes, especially the beginning of the semester. But a lot of times, what I'll say is in our field, a lot of what we do, if you go into research or even if you're just
Mm.
working on a committee together, you're working on a presentation together, is peer review. Peer review. And they just don't, it's hard to get sometimes for me at least to get my students to buy into that. So do you have any feedback or any advice on
Yeah.
that?
Well, teaching undergraduate students is very different from teaching graduate students. So,
Yeah.
God bless you. I love both, but y'all, I have to say it's just something about teaching graduate students that really my heart is so drawn to it. But
Hmm.
I would say with undergraduate students, you have to get to know them because sometimes that is a situation where it's like, well, I feel like I'm going to do all the work, but sometimes it could be other things. So getting to know them is always my first thing. But then also typically they're going to need a little more structure. So perhaps this is assigning roles. Perhaps this is giving them like that research-based experience. Well, in research world, the person who does the most work, their name goes first. So like your name is on it, but it's last because you didn't really do anything. Giving them opportunities to give each other feedback on how the group went. And also shifting, I think with undergraduates, you have to try different things like what is the experience when they get to choose their own group? What is the experience when you assign groups so they can work with people they wouldn't typically work with? What is the experience of them having affinity groups so they are working with people who are like-minded? I think, or, from a similar background, I think for graduate students, a lot of the strain with group work is because they're working, they're going to school. This
Yeah.
people in the group, well, they work at that group home all night. So when are we going to work on the assignment? So a lot of times they want to choose because, well, these people are my roommates. I would rather work with them because I know we're all going to be home at 8 and we could do this. So a lot of times I give them that autonomy to choose their group because it is a logistics thing. They have so many classes, they have clinic. It is hard to work in a group with someone who you can't get in contact with, right? But I think trying lots of different strategies is really important because every group of students can be so different. I know I have final conferences with students and the school-based class only had 5 students in it because it was an elective. And so we had this great little community and it was great. And one of the students was like talking about another student. They were like, yes, I never get to work in a group with them because they are on it and they are similar. So they basically said it was so nice to be in a group with this person because I'm always having to be the person that takes the lead. And then finally, I was in a group with them and it took that pressure off of me and we could share that balance. So there's so many dynamics, I think, but really getting to know your students. And then for undergraduate students, especially giving them structure on how to work in the groups is going to be helpful.
Yeah, and it's crazy because the class I teach is mostly always seniors. And so I remember when, when I was a senior in my CSC program, we knew pretty much everybody. We didn't, I mean, we had a decent size cohort, but had similar classes, for a couple of years in a row. So we knew most of the people in there. Again, you kind of knew who you didn't want to work with and who you did as undergrad, because a lot of those students weren't going on to go into the master's program or whatever. We had a lot of people who went into nursing, teaching, whatever. But the ones that now that I like my students that I find, a lot of them don't know each other. And I'm not at a commuter university per se, but a lot of them have had classes, but they don't interact in the same way that we did 15, 16 years ago. And it's interesting to see the dynamic of how many students are trying to work a full-time job, go to school full-time. I do have some that are parents. I have some, because again, I'm close to military bases, so I have a lot of military students who are spouses. It's a very interesting dynamic here for the undergraduate group to see how much they don't relate or know each other. And then they're in this class and I get them in the groups and they're looking at me like I'm crazy. They look at me like I'm crazy. And we're not even doing a high stakes assignment. We're just doing low stakes like class participation, test review, things like that before, because we have a grammatical categories test that they take that's part of the course, and we do that in a group format so that everybody gets time to look at these sentences that they're analyzing. And yeah, it's been crazy since, really, since the pandemic. Even before that though, I've been teaching this class on and off for 10 years, and thinking about my first group of students, my second group of students, and then these later groups of students, it's always been the same when it came to the group dynamic. If you allow them the autonomy, they're always going to pick the same peers because they know who they worked with before, and they really get upset if you do. And I remember this from me being in school, like, you're one, you're two, you're three, you're four. One, two, three, four, count it off. All the
Yeah.
ones get together, all the twos get together. You do that, and oh my gosh, it's like pandemonium in the classroom.
Like, please stop. Don't force this on us. You know, one thing that we did now that I'm thinking of it with undergrad, because I didn't teach undergrad this year, but previously I did. When I had a graduate assistant, which was just amazing, so helpful for my counseling class, we put them on groups. We actually had them because we really wanted to, this is a counseling class, it's touchy feely. So we want to build community. We want everyone to love each other. We did like a Valentine's Day brunch. I mean, we were very much community, right? And so even to start the class, I had my graduate assistant come up with a survey to give them. And we put them in groups because they had to do a lot of role play. And so we put them in groups and it was almost like matchmaking. Like if you watch those dating shows and they're like, your perfect match is here. And then the whole date, you're trying to find out why would they put me with this person? And so it's kind of like that in the sense of we put you with these people because y'all have similar interests, but it's really up to you to get to know that person and find out. So then by the end, they're like, I know why you grouped me with them. And so trying like getting a little out of the box, I think, but when it comes to the way that we group, they were in those groups the whole semester. So they actually got, I mean, if you worked with the same small group, you don't get to know the whole class, but maybe you got to know someone really well. And that was a nice opportunity for you in a semester. Because I think there's just the way people get to know each other is different these days with technology. You don't have to
Hmm.
talk to anyone in your class because probably you're on your phone talking to people on your phone in class. So you don't feel the need to be like, huh, I should make a new friend today. Why? I have friends. I'm literally in a group chat. I'm in 5 group chats right now. So it's just that like urgency and that need for connection, I think is there. It just looks different.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point because I always laugh when the students say that about midway through. Yeah, in the group chat, we were talking about the assignment and we all had the same question. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, well, and again, it's things that I say on day one when I'm going through the syllabus because, we have to hit these wickets for the university. They require us to say these certain things as far as policies go. And I usually will say, if you have a question, please don't be shy. If you don't feel like you can verbalize it in class, send me an email because 9 times out of 10, if you have a question, someone else has the same question or something very similar, and I'd rather address it to the group than you don't say anything. And working in healthcare for so long as I've done, me as a patient, I'm a terrible patient because I get irritated if you don't spend the time with me, but also I have a responsibility as a patient to come in prepared for my appointment because I know the tornado doctor's coming in or nurse practitioner and it's the 10-second tornado and if you're not prepared, you're not going to ask the questions. You're going to forget what the questions are. So I try to prepare the students in that same way and say, ask the question. If you don't feel comfortable verbalizing it, send me an email because, again, I'll address it in class, but I want you to have the space to know we have open communication. I want you to ask the question because if it puts you into a space where you feel the least little bit uncomfortable, that's the best learning space because you're going to seek out more information. You're probably going to Google it. That's what I do. If I have a question, I'm going to Google it and I'm going to try to find out more information, right? And I think it's the same thing for our students and they just for whatever reason need I think more strategy, more reinforcement, if you will, and a different type of reinforcement than maybe you needed in your course studies and than what I needed in mine. And I think that's the part that's a little bit trickier sometimes to figure out and changing our mindset.
Absolutely.
And we have a lot of comments, so I'm going to go back and look at those. So Carly said she was asked immediately for an obituary for proof after only missing 1 day. Yeah,
That's
sorry about that, Carly. And I'll share this real briefly. I worked in an outpatient clinic where I actually started the adult program, and when my mother-in-law passed away, I got asked to cover a clinic on a day I wasn't scheduled to work, and when I came back to work, it was the day before her memorial and I got written up for not being flexible. So, yeah, I totally feel that because and I know my manager at that point was she did that was intentional. It was intentional, and I know it was. And then someone said, I can see flexible deadlines allowing students to develop skills of time management and professional expectations even before entering the work field. Yeah, I think that's a great point because again, I think, and you touched on this, but time management and that intrinsic learning, when we're looking at how we want to manage our ongoing professional development, that's one of the things that we do. We're looking at things that interest us, or maybe sometimes we're looking at things that maybe they're not. Sometimes I find myself at state conferences and I'm like, well, this isn't really what I do from day to day, but I want to learn more about it because I heard the speaker was really good. Or this seems like an interesting course, and how could I relate what this pediatric SLP is doing with language development into my patients with aphasia? And so sometimes I'll do that. But yeah, I think that's a perfect example. And then Alexia, I work in private practice and I think it's important to introduce these ideas even in the work setting. Yeah, I think introducing flexible deadlines explicitly for clinicians in private practice settings would benefit the improved trust. Yeah, and I agree with that too because, again, when you're looking at writing articles for journals, sometimes those journal editors don't always get back to you in a timely fashion, but they have these deadlines they want you to adhere to, but then you don't get
Mhm.
the feedback that you need. I've had that happen too, and I'm sure you have as well.
Mhm. But when you said like this really helps with trust because it's like I trust that you're going to turn in your best work. So I trust if you needed more time, you really needed it. Just giving people the benefit of the doubt is an incredible way to set the tone. I have found that when I give my students grace, they give me grace. So when you've had those situations where a student is like, they turn in something and then 2 hours later, did you grade it? Can you give me, we don't do that up in here. We don't have urgency. So I don't do that to you. You don't do that to me. It is like a joint. We trust each other and we give each other grace. And I think that is the best way to set a tone for a work environment, for a classroom. It's beneficial everywhere.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's a lot of times what we find is we're, like I mentioned to you about earlier before we started recording about the university email and my email not working. It's the expectation that I have to wait for someone else to do something so I can do my work. And sometimes that's a frustration for
Mhm.
everybody. But at the same time, I'm trying not to be that person who's like hounding them. I'm like, hey, I didn't need to turn my computer off and back on again. I just really needed you to click that box because I went through my university checklist and realized when I looked at my available services, that one was not available. So if you could please advise me on how to help you help me. That kind of mindset I think goes further for a lot of people when you're saying, I realize that mistakes happen and maybe you did forget to check the box. We have these unexpected challenges in our personal life sometimes that do prevent us from grading in a I'm not going to have a 24-hour turnaround on a technical writing assignment. I have 24 students and I'm one person, and they're no matter how many times I say, no more than 2 to 3 pages is all I need, and I don't even really need that if you answered the question or you wrote up your clinical observation adequately. I may not need that much, but I don't need 5 to 10 pages, right? And when
Mhm.
you say that, and then they provide 5 to 10 pages, I'm like, well, that's going to take me a week because I again want to give you solid feedback. I want to make sure that the feedback I give you is adequate and is going to help you understand how to do your best work. So, well, as we're wrapping up, Danny, I just thank you, Dr. Scott. I'm sorry.
No, you can call me Dan. I was like, why so formal?
Some people are sticklers about their credentials, and I definitely don't want to overlook that, but I do really appreciate you coming on. I know we've had this in the works for a while, and I think the methodology and the ways that you're teaching are so crucial for our students, and I appreciate you sharing that with me, providing me with resources, and also we'll have some show notes posted with some research articles for the audience as well so that you can access those on your speech therapy PD account. Any last remarks from you, Dr. Scott?
No, thank you so much. I did make a little handout with some information that we were talking about tonight. So if you follow me at the CLD_SLP on Instagram, you can go to my link tree and I have articles that I've written. I've written maybe like two on the topic of inclusive teaching, and I have like some free handouts. And I would love to stay in touch with you and answer any further questions you have. But thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And Danny, thank you so much again for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.